darkness tries to rule over my bones, when sorrow comes steal the joy I own, when brokenness and pain is all I know, I won't be shaken. No, I won't be shaken. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. Shame no longer has a place to hide, and I'm not captive to the lies. I'm not afraid to leave my past behind. Oh, I won't be shaken. No, I won't be shaken. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. There's power that can break off every chain. There's power that can empty out a grave. There's resurrection power that can save. There's power in your name. Power in your name. There's power that can break off every chain. There's power that can empty out a grave. There's resurrection power that can save. There's power in your name. Power in your name. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love.
This is a time of service where we normally worship through giving. We're going to ask you to do one of three things. Number one, you can mail your tithe and offering to our physical address at 9248 Prince and Glendale Road, Westchester, Ohio, 45011. Number two, you can hold on to it until we meet again. Number three, you can visit the Tithely app, make an account, and search for Gospel Cincinnati. Thank you for your continued generosity.
Good morning, Gospel. It's good to be back with you again this week. I hope really soon to be back worshiping together here at the facility. We are looking forward to being together. If you're paying attention to the news, you'll notice that everything is beginning to open up. And I believe that we'll have some really good news for you in the not too distant future. Keep an eye on the webpage. We'll be sending out some emails and some text messages in the not too distant future to let you know what's going to be happening, when we're going to be opening back up. And as I said, it should be very, very soon. It'll be great to be back together. As I mentioned last week, when we do finally decide on a date, we will give you that date, and we will also give you some instructions. But as always, we're going to stress this. If you're fearful or if you have some underlying condition, please stay home. We'll be live streaming and putting our services out there for you to watch from home, so don't feel bad if you need to stay home. This morning I was thinking about what to bring and what to say. How can we, at least how can I bring you something that would encourage you, that would lift you up? And anytime I get the feeling that I need something special, I always go to the Old Testament. The Old Testament is my favorite part of the Bible. I don't know why. There's so many good stories in there. And if you're a member of Gospel, you've heard me say 100 times that in the Old Testament, my favorite character is Moses. Now, Moses was an interesting guy. You know, if you read the life of Moses, you read a lot about how he was brought up, born into the slave family, and because of the command of the king and how he's going to have all the babies killed, Moses' mother tried to hide him, realized she couldn't hide him, so she put him in the river, and as we know, Pharaoh's daughter found him. And so Moses was raised as the son of a king, the grandson of a king. Lived in the palaces, was educated by the king, had all the good things of life. And if we know the story of Moses, we understand that I'm sure he questioned his heritage at times. And it's interesting to follow along with that story because we know what happens as Moses is beginning to realize who he is. He sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating one of the slaves, one of the Hebrew slaves. Moses intervenes and fights with this Egyptian and ends up killing him. Everyone finds out about it. Of course, everyone would find out about it because you've got the son of Pharaoh out there killing one of the Egyptians, and Moses gets banished to the desert. He's let out there and to fend for himself, basically. And it's interesting if you read the story of Moses, he finds himself far away from Egypt, far away from home, in a strange land, trying to find a way to live, what way to survive. And he stumbles in on the settlement of what becomes his father-in-law. And he finds a wife. It begins the life of a shepherd, begins the life of peacefulness. And that's where we pick up Moses' life. We're going to learn some things this morning about an unexpected direction that God gives Moses in an unexpected way. In fact, this morning, that's what we're going to call our message is unexpected. You know, what we find out a lot in our lives is God will direct us and he will give us guidance. And sometimes it's a really in an unexpected way. We're going to be in the book of Exodus this morning. Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 1, we're going to read there. And what it says in Exodus 3:1, it says, "Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame out of the fire, out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, but the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called him unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up into a land, unto a good place, and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto a place of the Canaanites, and of the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppress them. Come now therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my children, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses said unto God, Who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, Certainly I will be with thee, and shall be a token unto thee, that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. And Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say unto me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them? And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. And God said moreover unto Moses, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, The God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, hath sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. This is the Moses' call out of a burning bush. As Moses was sitting there minding his own business, he looks up on a mountainside and he sees a bush burning. And as he watches this thing, he realizes that the bush is burning, but is not consumed. And as he goes up, God begins to meet with him there. And as I was looking over this story, one of my favorite stories, as I was looking over this, I realized that there are some real valuable lessons for us as Christian people, for us as people trying to have a relationship with Jesus and trying to do what God would find pleasing. I think there's some real valuable lessons for us to learn, especially as we are now coming out of this whole corona thing. God willing, we're on the backside of this. But sometimes, and I don't know about you, but sometimes through this thing, I felt alone. I felt abandoned. I felt like there's very little I could do. And what we find here is God comes to speak to Moses as he's out on the backside of the desert, tending sheep, minding his own business. God brings to him some very valuable lessons that I think as we are pretty much feeling the same way as Moses, sometimes feeling forgotten and abandoned, or maybe just alone. There's some things here that we can find about God that can bring real stability to our lives, can bring us real joy and real contentment. So let's look at a few of those this morning, just a few quick lessons that we can learn out of the burning bush. Here's the first thing that I think I picked up as soon as I was reading this again, is this: God is not uninterested. What I'm saying here is a lot of times we feel like, or we believe that God is not interested in me as an individual. Who am I? You know, I'm just a normal guy trying to live a normal life. Why would God be interested in me? But the truth of the matter is God is interested. How do we know that? Because as Moses begins to come up on the mountain, God calls him by name. He says, Moses, Moses. Here's what I think is really interesting about that is this, that he knew exactly where Moses was. Sometimes I think we feel like that God doesn't know who we are, or maybe that God doesn't know where we are, maybe doesn't care who we are or where we are. But the truth of the matter is, according to Psalms 139, God is everywhere. The psalmist writes in Psalms 139, there's no place I can go, whether it's heaven or wherever, there's no place I can go that you're not there. And the truth of the matter is, wherever we are, he's there. It's interesting sometimes in our lives that we begin to feel that way because we feel alone. We feel, and the reason we feel that is because we don't understand how important we are to God. We're so important to God that he sent his son to die for us. So as we begin to look at this unexpected transaction between God and Moses, one of the big things we need to take away from this is God is not uninterested in us. I'm sure as Moses was transitioning and had spent the last 40 years in the desert, in the wilderness, wandering about with his new wife and his kids, and probably set up a house and had his house and had his job as a shepherd, had a car and a bass boat, and he was planning a vacation when God comes to him and says to him, look, I got something for you to do. Moses probably felt like his life was pretty set. And I'm sure that he felt like God had no need for him. It's important for us to understand as we sit here coming out from this coronavirus thing, and as we've been sheltering in place and staying safely away from all these things as we should have, that God hasn't forgot about us. That God knows exactly where we are, and he knows my name. I know a lot of times pastors will talk about that God knows the very hairs on your head. I'm not going to talk about that because that just leaves me up for ridicule. People saying that it's easier for him to know my hairs than most people, but we're not going to talk about that. So he knew exactly where he was. Another lesson I think we can learn from Moses as he's here on the backside of the desert, these unexpected meeting with God, is this, that complacency oftentimes leads to inactivity. As we talked about, Moses was living his life, probably fairly settled, probably fairly satisfied. I mean, he wasn't living in the palaces of Egypt. He knew that was no longer a possibility, but he had made a life for himself. He now was married. He had children. He was tending his father-in-law Jethro's sheep. I'm sure he's doing much more than that. He was probably his right-hand man. He was there making sure that everything was done properly and everything was done the way it needed to be done. He was running the farm, running the ranch, if you will, tending his own life. And he was probably fairly content with the things that had happened to him. But as I was thinking about that, and there's nothing wrong with being satisfied with your life, because the Bible talks about us having great joy, and in that joy is great satisfaction. But so often when we get, there's a difference between being satisfied and just being complacent. And so many times we get to that point of complacency in our life, and especially with our relationship with Jesus. We become happy with where we are, and we stop moving forward in our relationship. We stop pushing for more. We stop digging deeper. We stop trying to get closer. And the reason I say that in this story is because he's lived out on the desert now for 40 years. What happened to that fire inside of Moses that drove him to kill the Egyptian? He knows that his people, the Israelites, the Hebrews, are still back in captivity. And it made him so angry when the one was getting beat that he had to begin to fight the Egyptian. Where is that fire? Why is Moses not every day trying to get back there to help those people? And so often, inactivity comes from complacency. We get satisfied. There's also that feeling of what can I do? You know, we'll get to that in a few minutes, but that's one of the things. Who am I that I can do these things, you know? Here's another lesson I think that's very, very important for us to learn out of this Moses story, is this. And this is going to seem rather juvenile maybe. You know, the phrase I always use is, this is going to sound very Sunday school-ish, right? But here it is. God is God, always. Now, what am I talking about? That does sound very basic. We know that God is God, but here's what we've got. We've got God talking to Moses out of the burning bush. And as Moses begins to approach the bush and approach God, God begins to speak to him and he says, "Stop, Moses. Oh, wait a minute. Take off those shoes from your feet, because where you're standing is holy ground." What made that ground holy? Because God was there. We need to understand that God is holy, that God is righteous, that God is just, that God is amazing. And he needs to be reverenced and he needs to be honored because of who he is. And in our life, we have to understand that God is in control. And God, as we said a minute ago, hasn't forgotten us. He knows where we are. He knows us by name. But the truth of the matter is, we have this relationship with an all-powerful God, and he is holy, and he is always, always God. You know, there's the old expression, and I used to say this to my kids, and you know, I say it sometimes to the grandkids. It's this, you know, when I would talk to my kids about something, I'd say, you know what, I may not always be right, but I'm always dad. And that's the truth with God. God is always right. And so often we become so used to who God is. We become so accustomed to our relationship with God that it loses some of the awe that it needs to have, some of the amazement that it needs to have. We have to understand that God is always God. And if we understand that, then we begin to get some of that amazement back, because why would a God that created the entire universe, a God that loves everyone and everything, God that sustains us and keeps us, why would he be so concerned with me as an individual? That's what's amazing. He tells Moses, look, take your shoes off. You're standing on holy ground. I think that's amazing. I think it's the fact that God is telling Moses, I'm here to talk to you. I'm here to commune with you. I am here to give you direction. I'm here to assure you that I love you, but always remember who I am. That's so important in our lives. Here's something else I think is really important, is this. As we're learning these lessons from Moses, it's this, that God pays attention. We read verses 7 through 10 here in Exodus chapter 3 just a few minutes ago, but in these verses, as God is talking to Moses and telling him about what he's done and how he's seen all these things and how he understands, I'm sure that the children of Israel had thought that God had forgotten all about them. And we know, we've quoted around here all the time that, God works all things together for his good. And sometimes those all things take a while. I get that, because God is dealing with human beings with the right to choose. But we have to understand that God is paying attention to us. He's not turned his back on us. He's not left us alone. He's not ignoring us. He's not leaving us to our own devices. Because in verses 7 through 10, God says these things to Moses. He says, I have seen the affliction. I have heard the cries. I am come to do something about them. I will bring them out. And he says, I will send you. God pays attention. That has good side and bad side, if you stop and think about it. So often those things that we do in private, we think we do in private, those things that we think we've gotten away with, those things are not necessarily private and we've gotten away with, because God says, I pay attention. Even to the most secret place, God is there. So here we got the children of Israel and Moses probably thinking that God has forgotten all about them. But God says, that's not so. I have paid attention. I have seen. I have heard. I am come. All of these things that we find in verses 7 through 10 about God talking to Moses, about God telling Moses what he realizes about the children of Israel. And basically what goes on here is God is saying, look, all things that we talk about, he says, Moses, those have all come to this place. They've all come to a head. And now we're going to do something about it. I love the fact that God pays attention to us. Even in the most mundane things that we think are mundane, God is a part. Even the things that we think that he would not be interested in, he's interested in. So from the very most minutiae thing in our life to the most important thing there is, God pays attention. That's exciting, because what we have to understand is when things are not so great for us, when things are not where we want them to be, God knows. When things are great for us, when we're excited and we're jubilant, God knows, because he pays attention. And here's what I think is interesting. What do you pay attention to? You only pay attention to those things that you love. And this is just another way that God says, I love you. So we see these lessons that we can learn from this burning bush experience, this unexpected time with God and Moses. And I think it's interesting that we see Moses' reaction. Because towards the end of this chapter, as we were reading down through verse 15, Moses asks two questions about these lessons that he's learned, about the call that God has given to him. And I think these two questions are really important for us to come to grips with, especially the first question. Moses asks this question to God. He says, God, who am I to lead your people out? The reason I love this question is because we've all been here. We've all been to this place. Who am I that God would want to use me? Who am I that God would see fit to call me into his work. Because I believe that we all have ministry. I say that all the time. You know, we're all ministers, not just Pastor Chris and myself. We're all ministers. We all have a ministry to do. God calls us into those things. And so often, the reason that most people don't get involved in the ministry that God calls them into is because they can't handle this question. They haven't got an answer to this question. And Moses asked that question. He said, God, who am I that you would want to use me? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? You know what God's answer is? He said, don't worry about it, man. I'm with you. You're mine. That's who you are. We today hold the name Christian. That's who we are. We're saved by the blood of Jesus. That's who we are. He calls us into ministry because he wants us to be with him. He wants us working alongside of him. Moses asks a very pertinent question, a question that we all have to deal with. Who am I? In and of ourselves, we're nobody. God doesn't need us. God chooses us, and that makes us somebody. The second question that Moses asked here that I think is really a really good question, and probably one that we've all asked also, is, how can I explain it? Moses says, well, what if they don't believe me? What am I going to say? Who am I going to say sends me? How can I explain all this stuff? And God has a very simple explanation. When Moses asked him, how can I explain this? Or how can I tell them? Who am I? God just says real simply, Moses, tell them that I sent you. That should be enough. You see, our responsibility is not the success or the failure. Our responsibility is quite simply the message. The Bible tells us that some waters, some plant, some waters, but it's God that gives the increase. Our responsibility is not tied up in who we are. Our responsibility is tied up in who he is. Moses asked the question, how am I going to explain this? What if they don't believe me? God says, that's up to me. Just tell them that I sent you. You see, that's what ministry is all about. Ministry is all about telling other people about Jesus in whatever way you can do it. Not all of us can get up and preach a message. Not all of us can get up and teach a Sunday school class. Not all of us can get up and do some of those kind of things. But we all have ministry, and we can all do something to reach others. There are people in your lives that I will never speak to. There are people in your lives that I may get a chance to speak to, but they won't react to me the same way they react to you. That's your ministry, to present Jesus to those. And how do we do that? We do it by telling people. We do it by living an example in front of people. We do it simply by mirroring Christ in our lives. You say, wait a minute, Pastor, that's a lot of responsibility. Yes, it is. But Pastor, I can't do that. That's one of the things Moses said when he took on this new task. He said, I'm slow of speech. I can't do this kind of stuff. And you know what God said? You're right, Moses, you can't, but I can through you. That's ministry. Here's something that a college professor once told me. So that's been a lot of years ago, but it stuck with me through all these years. The man's name was Bill Dow. He pastored a church in Springfield, Missouri, and he was one of my professors. And I'll never forget, he was teaching a class of itinerant preachers. They call us preacher boys. And he was teaching about our ministry and our calling. And he said this, and it fits for every one of us. He said this: we are not called to be extraordinary. We are called to do extraordinary. It's not about us. It's all about Jesus. Gospel, I hope that you've enjoyed the message. I hope you've got some encouragement today from the life of Moses and his meeting with God in an unexpected way. Pretty soon, very soon, we'll be back together. Every day we hear about more things opening up, and I'm confident that we will be back together very soon. Keep an eye out for messages on our Facebook page, messages on our website. Check them every day because it won't be long. God bless you. We'll see you next week.